Welcome to the first panel for our conference. And in this panel, we are going to speak about one of the major challenges facing youth in our region, in particular focusing on Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine. And in this panel, we are going to discuss youth unemployment across several key dimensions. This is a very big topic, and we won't be able to do it justice even if we were to discuss it the entire weekend. But we are going to try and focus on different aspects that entail thinking about entrepreneurship ecosystem, thinking about mismatch of skills in the job market, thinking about how do we promote inclusive employment for migrants as well as the host communities alike, and how do we navigate that through informal economies, which are really large in our system, in our countries. So allow me to begin with some statistics, to throw them on the table. 2019, in Palestine alone, we have 46% of its total labor force aged between 15 and 24 as unemployed. Jordan ranks at 37%, Lebanon 18%, and Syria 20% during the same year. This is just 2019. I would like to welcome our panelists for today. We have Dr. Maysoon Sukkariyi, who is a senior lecturer in the Anthropology of Development in the Department of International Development at King's College, London. We have Professor Adil Malik, who's also a Rhodes Scholar. Adil Malik is an associate professor at the Oxford Department of International Development and a global fellow in economies of Muslim societies at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. We have Dr. Bilal Mlaib, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Global Affairs at the London School of Economics. We have Maysa Jalbout, who is a leader in philanthropy and international development, especially education. She is a global advisor, including special advisor to MIT and ASU on the SDGs, and was the founding CEO of the Queen Rania Foundation and Abdullah Al Ghurair Foundation for Education. We have Dr. Kinan Bahnasi, who has substantive international, technical, and policy-making experience, having spent the majority of his career working in various UN agencies. So, welcome. And I guess I would like to start first with a bigger picture view, a discussion more about employment, growth prospects in our region, and kind of setting the stage of how do we understand it. And I'd like to give the opportunity for Professor Adil Malik to take the lead on that.
Thank you very much, Diara. And I would like to begin by thanking the Rhodes House for this kind invitation. 20 years ago, when I came as a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, it would have been unthinkable, unimaginable that we'll be having a discussion on the Arab world with lots of Arab scholars. So I think it's a real tribute to how far the Rhodes House has come in terms of its expansion of the global constituency. I want to take a step back. I was sitting here listening to the first two presentations, and I thought it would be a good time to talk about the larger picture before we talk about concrete problems and their concrete solutions. In the traditional Oxford sense of, the whole is bigger than the sum of its part. When it comes to the region, we now recognize that there are huge problems in terms of unemployment, violence, conflict, the problems of oil riches. One thing is clear since the start of the first Arab uprising, which is that the Arab model for development, if there is such a thing, has failed. It has reached its expiry date. Now, we know that this model of development is based on the inflow of oil and external rents. It's based on a huge state that is failing to deliver. It's based on a very weak private sector, large informal sectors. And it is youth unemployment, in a sense, is an outcome. It's a symptom of this failing model. And in fact, many of the people who've worked on Arab labor markets tell us that actually since the 1990s, we now see a huge insider-outsider problem. That this model of development is generating a class of outsiders who cannot enter the labor market. And these are people who are young and mostly female. right? They cannot find jobs in the private sector, and they cannot find jobs in the public sector, which is the preferred venue. And there's huge informality. Now, within that context, when we think about the Arab model for development, a lot of my research has focused on the role of markets, but not for the reason that the World Bank director was talking about, not for the reason, the way in which neoliberal economic thinking has thought about markets. I think markets have been repressed in the same way as politics has been repressed in the region. And again, I'm not talking with regards to traditional thinking on market repression, how financial markets are repressed, but repression in the sense that markets are controlled for political purposes, for geopolitical purposes. So we cannot have a real discussion on private sector development, on employment, unless we think about markets. What role should they serve? How they should be reimagined? And in doing that, we cannot ignore the role of politics, which is hugely important because markets and politics have co-evolved. And we cannot ignore the question of market access, which is linked with geopolitics, and I'll explain that shortly. When I talk about markets, I think there are two aspects that are crucial for me. The first is autonomy, and the second is participation. On neither of these two dimensions are Arab markets well developed, right? Not everybody can participate, and so there's very little participation, and they're not autonomous from political influences. Much of my recent research has shown how networks of privilege have emerged in the wake of economic liberalization of the 1990s, in a sense that much of the economic power is concentrated amongst a handful of people around the royal circle, right? And there are plentiful examples of this, right? In Benelux, Tunisia, 220 firms dominating the onshore sector. In Egypt, connected firms benefiting from 92% of loans that are given to them. In Lebanon, we have huge monopolies that are often organized along sectarian lines. In Morocco, the king makes decisions for the real estate sector. The big decisions are made by literally 3 people in the country. In Saudi Arabia, royal expropriations of firms are very common. So we have a form of capitalism in the wake of liberalization where the state reduced its footprint, but the private sector that we had is not really genuinely private, right? It's a predatory form of capitalism which generates exclusion. If you talk to any Arab businessman today, they would say, well, we can grow up to a level, but to go beyond that, we need to partner with one of the regime insiders. And that is the logic of what I call partner or perish. Either you cooperate with the regime insider or you perish. And these entry barriers are partly political in nature. Now, my other contention, and I'll finish at that because I know we are short of time, is this question about how the region at the present moment is trapped in a very vicious equilibrium. I think it's not how one government or one donor can solve the problem. We need to take a holistic picture. And I want to bring back a question that is very close to Arab Street, very close to Arab policymakers, at least historically, but it is a political impossibility at the moment. And that's the question of regional economic integration. It's the question of market access. Unless you create a large connected market in the region, you are unlikely to have a really well-developed private sector and to solve the employment challenge. That requires new political imagination at the level of the street, and new political imagination at the level of donors. But here's why it is difficult. It is difficult because a lot of the governments rely on these cronies, business cronies. By closing off the market, they're able to generate unearned income streams for insiders. If you open the market, obviously it's going to be a threat. And it's a geopolitical threat too, because if you have an Arab market that is connected, it will create new forms of political power. It will change the regional geopolitical balance. And that is why we are stuck in an equilibrium where there are neither domestic politicians nor global stakeholders who can shape elite incentives have any genuine interest in regional economic cooperation. But I would like to end by saying that if there is a single most important collective action challenge for the Middle East in the 21st century, it is to create regional economic cooperation. And by that, I mean to say, create a regionally integrated merchant class, Without a regionally integrated merchant class, you cannot create new forms of politics, you cannot create new forms of market, and you cannot solve the long-term challenge of unemployment, corruption, and what you have. I have a lot of comments about where we could go in future, how to make transition towards that equilibrium, but I'll keep that to the Q&A session.
Absolutely. So good hints for questions for later. But really insightful comments in terms of the key challenges facing unemployment in general. And perhaps I'd like us to go back to the idea of youth and kind of think whether we have some disproportionate impact that's affecting youth a bit more than the other age groups. Building on those channels, Dr. Maysoon, if you could kind of tell us more about that, focusing on this particular age category, navigating those challenges in a way.
Okay. I think I'm an anthropologist, so I come from a totally different perspective than the development and economist.
Which is very welcome.
I don't have numbers, but well, yes, of course, young people will be affected generally by unemployment because it's a challenge of transition from school to work. And then there is also when you enter the job market for the first time, there is a time when you change jobs and so on. So the unemployment level will be different from the adult. But there are two sets of factors that play here when we talk about youth unemployment. There are the youth unemployment at a time when there are jobs, so when the economy is okay, and there are the other stats when the economy is not doing well, when we have a crisis like we have now, from the 2008 till now. So at a time when there is a stability, usually, the challenges of youth are different from those of adults because, the transition and entering the job market. But at a time of a crisis, both of them have the same challenges, which is no jobs in the market, basically. As for the why they are different, I want to flip the question and talk about, is it really different at a time of crisis? And here I want to talk about why do we single out youth unemployment? And as Fadi said in his talk, it's like, the youth bulge. So the whole frenzy of youth bulge, and it was really very prominent after the crisis. Well, it was prominent in the immediately after the war on terror, and then after the crisis and after the Arab Spring. So whenever there is a challenge, so youth are provoked or invoked as a challenge. And this is not only in the Middle East, it is all over the world, in the global economy. So after the crisis, there was so much about the lost generation, even here in Europe. So find them jobs, otherwise, we are going to be in trouble. It's a lost generation. And in the Arab world, it was a the bomb, so ticking time bomb. So I mean, so in that, so so we want to, when you have something that becomes hegemonic, the focus on youth unemployment other than unemployment at a time of crisis, then we have to ask, why? We have to be critical about the hegemony of youth unemployment. If the scale, well, there are many issues why it is huge. So there is a misrepresentation and misframing of youth unemployment. So for example, in 2015, there was a BBC statistics, and then the headline was 90% of Arab youth are unemployed, okay? So the rate of youth unemployment in the Arab world was 90%. Okay, yes, the rate of unemployment is really high, but it doesn't mean that 90% of young people between 16 and 24 are unemployed because they are using rate, not ratio. And with the rate, they measure the youth unemployment against the whole youth population. But we know that many young people between 16 and 24 are in schools at that time. So that's why the rate is really high. When we do the ratio, which is the youth unemployment rate as for those, compared to those who are applying for jobs at that time, so it becomes really, really much less. So why are we exaggerating the number? This is the important things. Also, the ILO in 2010, they released a report, and the report was like on global, it was called like why global youth unemployment. And in the report, they talk about like exclusion, idleness, health problems that comes out of being unemployed and young. But these are problems also that adults can suffer from if they are unemployed. Health problems, feeling alienated, family issues, and so on. But if you look closely at the ILO, actually, it doesn't say that the youth unemployment is higher than general unemployment, but it was picked up as it is a youth unemployment problem, and for the reasons I will mention later. So if you look closely, they say, actually, it says that it's actually the ratio of youth to adults unemployment rate globally improved from 2.9 to 2.6 after the crisis. So it's not what it was picked up. Also, the EU released a report in 2014, and the report concluded that it was the people from 25 to 34 and 34 to 45 are the most hit by the crisis, not the younger generation. So here we want to ask why. I still have time, right? So, I mean, like, when you see this, we will have to ask why is the focus on youth if it is not as exaggerated as we see it in the market. And then, it has so many, promoting youth under unemployment has so many reasons. First of all, it shifts the problems from the economy to youth and education and skills. This is one. Two, it makes it a generational war, so it's the older generation are benefiting from the pensions, and we need to lessen the pension, and this happened here in this country. Yeah. And so let's take the pensions from the old people so we create employment for the younger generation. And then also it promotes the youth deficit, so they don't have the skills to work in the global economy, and they have low skills. We need to see how we fix them. They have very high expectation, as if jobs are everywhere, and the young people are the ones who are not taking them. So, and there are other issues I can talk about later.
Absolutely, and I think those are really welcome points of debate. And something to pick up on there is, I agree with you, let's get back to that problems in the structure of the economy. What are we looking at here? And one perhaps stands out as something I think you were referring to, and as well you, Professor Malik, increasing that size of the pie, improving the better employment prospects. So perhaps a supply story, should we improve kind of employment? One avenue could be entrepreneurship and looking at the ecosystems that would allow businesses to grow there. And yeah, so I'm interested in whether, if you go back to that structure of the economy, in a sense, do we have an ecosystem conducive for the growth of small businesses and enterprises? Kinan, I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, thank you very much, Diala, and thanks for the organizers, Rhodes House, for having me here. I came all the way from Georgia to Tbilisi. That's where I'm based right now. It's a very fascinating country in terms of the growth and how things were changed from after the collapse of the Soviets until today. So I think there's a lot we can learn from that side. But this is not what I'm going to talk about. But I just wanted, because entrepreneurship has been now also a big thing with that part of the world as well. Now, first, as Diala said, there has been a big promise in the past about the public employments of a lot of young people waiting to get jobs in the public sectors, right? I mean, that's what we all understood employment in the past. And then we were told that there's entrepreneurship. And then people were actually get to choose between seeking a job or becoming an entrepreneur. But then we realized that people are not really prepared to become an entrepreneur. There's still like a lot of skills, leaderships, all sorts of things that we can actually need to create such vibrant communities of entrepreneurs. And then we started with training. We said, okay, so what is it What will it take? Let's do some entrepreneurship training, okay? And ILO, one of the leading organizations, as long as many other UN organizations as well, that they've developed very good training systems to develop entrepreneurship, right? To let people know how they can start a business, to tell them how they can write a business plan, because that's the access to finance, that's the future, that's what the idea is. And then we did that. And the success wasn't quite high. Because we learned that entrepreneurship, it's not only about having a talent and also having a brilliant idea. It's all about a very much well-connected system that we have to look at it very holistically in order for us to tackle. We've learned that in order for entrepreneurs to find access to market, we need to create market. In order for entrepreneurs to be able to receive some funding to start up with, or to even to grow, or to have any sort of export potential, as we are all aspire to have, we learned about access to finance, loans, grants, and that's how important it is to be there as well. And then we've actually looked at other aspects related to the legislation. Our legislations were pretty much set for people to go and find a job, look for a job. They're not really set for entrepreneurs. Let's just be honest with that. Okay? They're not creating this conducive environment that Diallo was referring to. Is that for them to go ahead and right away jump into a very competitive market where they can introduce all of their new products and services. So, and that's why we're ranked among I would say the lowest on World Bank doing business reports. I mean, all of the 4 countries now, Jordan has been doing slightly much better than the rest. But we're still quite behind compared to a lot of other Eastern European countries or any countries that we would like to compare ourselves to. Because I think it's good to have a benchmark here. I don't know who we compare ourselves to. That's also something that I would like to make sure that we learn from others and see where the future is envisaged and how we can actually reach there. So back again to the ecosystem. So we learned that the ecosystem is not only one piece. It's not only about capacity and about a mindset. Of course, culture, mindset, influenced by behavior, by family, that all makes us to become an entrepreneurs. But we also learned there are a lot of pieces, okay, of the puzzles that all have to be connected together in order for those entrepreneurs to strive. You need a market, you need legislation, you need access to capital, you need also support, training, you need technical assistance, you need business development services, you need policy that would actually allow you to feel safe and secured about your businesses. Many ideas I know that started in Syria 10 years ago, in games industries, but they couldn't actually survive because we can't even protect their intellectual property. And they were actually headhunted by Microsoft and so many other companies. Now I'm happy to see them in Seattle. Well, the point is if you want to create this entrepreneurship, you want to go ahead and promote technology, where's the puzzle? What are we doing here? How are we creating a better picture that we ensure that those entrepreneurs will actually going to survive, and also their ideas is going to create jobs? And that's the point that I would like to raise here, that we also want not any kind of entrepreneurship. I mean, we've talked about it. We've done a lot of entrepreneurial work in the past. We actually created self-employment. We didn't create many entrepreneurs. Let's just be honest. We create many freelancers, okay? But we didn't really create great ideas that could take a lead on entrepreneurship and become like Amazon or eBay or Google. We still, yes, there are a few that we will be mentioning soon. But that's entrepreneurship, what it is to us, other than just self-employed. What the potential that entrepreneurship will create in terms of jobs. Are we creating quality jobs? That's the kind of the future that we want. We don't want to create a lot of street vendors. Yeah. When we call it entrepreneurship. So back again, I will be talking more about this in my breakout session. I've used my time?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll go back to that in Q&A, but I thought it was really interesting when you were discussing a lot about the quality kind of jobs, and I guess the kind of complementary to that is the skills that we need within the labor force. And just looking at the educated population here, I don't mean just years of schooling. We need to be looking at skills differently to be complementary to that ecosystem and the policies. Perhaps I'd like to ask you, Dr. Mais, about your opinion on that. Kind of thinking about skills being complementary to creating the quality jobs. And where should we look? Where are the opportunities there?
You know, this issue of lack of skills in the Middle East has been haunting the region for several decades. It's not a new issue. Many people in this room have talked about it, written about it. I recently published a report in Brookings about the impact of technology and skills in the region and what it means for our region. There's this idea that what the education system is producing in the region is mismatched with what the employment sector is looking for. And this remains true today. And of course, the only solution there is education reform, all the way from K-12 to higher education. But what I really want to talk about today is not the same old thing, because I think we've all talked about this a lot. I want to get to solutions, but before we get to sort of the nitty-gritty of what solutions we all need to be thinking about, or I'm sure there are lots of ideas in the room, for me, I think what we're really missing is changing our mindset about youth and unemployment in the region. I think that we're really stuck in solving the problem in the past, and the world is changing very, very rapidly. I work with vulnerable people around the world, including the Middle East, and what we're finding is that many of the problems that we're facing in the region are also facing rural communities in America, parts of Europe, everywhere in the world. Wherever there are marginalized people, wherever there are people who are feeling that their jobs are at threat, they're starting to feel the same issues that we're feeling in the region. Of course, there are differences. There are lots of nuances. And the main challenge for us in the region is the scale and the magnitude of the issues that we're facing. So we don't talk about it enough, but we often solve for a small number of people. And this is no longer good enough. 70% of the population in the Arab world is either living below the poverty line or is vulnerable. 70%. But yet, what do we talk about when we get together? Me included. We talk about scholarships for a few people. No offense to any scholarship program. I think they're great. I've run some of the biggest ones. But they're not going to solve our problem. We need to think about things from a system-level perspective. This is the only way things are going to change. This doesn't negate the need that it's amazing there are so many people that are doing things to help lots of people. But real change requires system-level thinking. We're facing a world that is changing very, very rapidly. And my fear for the Arab world is that we're not part of that change. And what I really want to talk about today is how do we actually start being part of defining the kind of world we want to live in, being participants as opposed to being, victims or left behind. So what is the biggest thing that's changing our lives today? Well, there are three, in my opinion, that are really shaping our future that we need to be looking at to solve the issue of youth unemployment. The first is technology. Technology is completely changing the way that we work, the way we learn, the way we communicate, the way we live. But if you think about our education system and the way we work, it's not actually taking advantage of technological solutions. We're still talking about getting people, young people, into universities that take high-quality universities, take very small numbers of young people. We're not talking about how technology can really change the way we learn. Most of the Arab world at the moment does not accredit online education. That is completely regressive. I mean, the fact that you can go to a university, a high-quality university anywhere in the world, attain a degree online, but then not have it accredited in the Arab world. We're still, at the top universities in the region, we're still paying $120,000 to educate a student. How many vulnerable kids can you actually educate with that? And the solution that you otherwise face is to send them to a public university that's going to produce the same graduates with the same skill sets that are going to flood the market with unskilled youth. So ICTs, technologies, we need to think about what is the impact of that on the way we think about the youth unemployment problem. The second, and we don't talk about this at all in the Arab world, and it's absolutely terrifying, climate change. It's talked about everywhere but in the region. And it is going to have a massive impact on the region. If you think about a country like Jordan, it's one of the first countries that's going to run out of water. And you know, when you think about what's happening with refugee and migrating populations, many of them already today are becoming refugees because of climate change. Think about the future and what that means. Why aren't we investing in green technology in the region like we should be? Why aren't we encouraging young people to study the environment as opposed to other areas that are not producing jobs? And the third trend, and it's a very unfortunate one, and it's one that touches me very personally, and I think many people in this room, is conflict. Conflict is really eroding all the gains that we're making in the region at a very, very large scale. I was just in Greece, where I'm working on the refugee crisis there, and we'll be sharing a report with hopefully all of you very soon. And I was on the island of Lesbos at the Moria camp, and meeting with some of the refugees and the NGOs that are working with there. And I suddenly realized that I was standing in a circle with kids from all across the Arab region. Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, Yemen, Sudan. They're all in Greece on an island. When you ask them why are they there, they're actually leaving a region that's let them down. And they're trying to get to Europe because the number one reason that they want to get to Europe is they want to get a good education and hopefully have a job that lifts them out of poverty and out of the situation they're in. So if we don't start having this mind shift, if we don't start thinking about how we move away from this mentality of scarcity to thinking about abundance and how opportunity can be for everyone, how we solve not for the few, but for the many, for everyone, and how we stop thinking about the past and its problems and really start thinking about the future and how we solve for them in different ways. This is the first thing that we have to do before we get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I guess it's really promising, kind of the movement towards knowledge economies and employing technology and so on. And if you would allow me to kind of challenge that a little bit and ask whether our economies are actually moving in that direction or not. I mean, our economies still have very large informal sector, and we have recent influx of refugees that potentially have changed the employment arena. So perhaps Bilal, if you can comment on that, if you can comment more about how our region has been changing in recent years with the recent developments in the region, and are we moving in the right direction towards the kind of promises that Maysa was pointing to in reference to refugees, informality, and growth?
Yeah, thank you so much, Diala, and thanks for this invitation. I mean, before getting into that, if you allow me, there are some structural issues in the labor market that, I mean, were touched on the panel, but worth highlighting a little bit. Primarily around the role of the public sector and the infatuation, really, that we have in many of our economies with the public sector. The public sector, I mean, Adil in the beginning said the private sector is not very private, it's a little bit public. But you can say the same about the public sector. It's very much used for private gains, the patronage that is entrenched in the public sector and how it's used to really further clientelistic interests. And then you have the public sector, which is filled with cronyism and a lot of favoritism, and therefore the youth, but also not just the youth, as Maysoon said, are stuck very much between a rock and a hard place. Okay. So there are no opportunities here nor there, and with lack of an ecosystem that promotes entrepreneurship and startups, well, not much you can do. So the question here has a social, economic, and political dimension that we must not sort of ignore in the discourse. Now, another issue that we must also be cognizant of is labor force participation. So we're talking about employment and taking that for granted, but the fact is that the labor force participation is also very low. Yes. I mean, taking recent statistics in Lebanon, you see that the labor force participation, which is basically the willingness to get a job. So unemployment is whether you have a job subject to being willing to get a job or wanting and seeking a job. But the willingness and seeking a job is also very low. In recent statistics of both Lebanese and Syrians and Palestinians in Lebanon, apart from those in camps, actually the ILO did this recent study, the labor force survey, which is very much welcome in Lebanon in the dearth of data we have. There's 50% labor force participation. And one can, explain this in many ways. There's low inclusion of women in the labor market. There's refugees who are excluded from the labor market. But there's also, the fact of the matter is that there's low demand for the labor force. So there is a story of exclusion there, and a story of sort of being disenfranchised, being outside the system and not finding the road within it. And then we come to the refugee story, and along that story, there is the political discourse that they're stealing our jobs, they are contributing to worsening the economy or increasing the informal sector. But let's unpack this a little bit. In Jordan, we had a golden opportunity a couple of years ago with a new labor force panel survey. Panel survey is when we track the same individuals over time. So we had an opportunity of seeing the same individuals, same Jordanians in 2010 and 2016 in a nationally representative survey. 2016 obviously was after the refugee crisis, 2010 was before that. And actually, let's not call it a crisis, it's a refugee influx. Throughout that period, we had an opportunity to see what is the impact of the Syrian refugee influx on the economy. What you quickly find is that the demand of jobs from Jordanians is primarily in the public sector. Syrians are excluded from the public sector, and therefore there is no room for competition. And so the story of them stealing our jobs and them competing on jobs with us is a very narrow avenue that we've been taking. And indeed, we proved it empirically, and I don't think it should come as a surprise that there is no impact on the labor market from the refugee influx in Jordan. And comparing it with other stories around the world, we know that the refugee influx can be a promise rather than a doom, and it can increase the pie rather than decrease it. But what do we find on top of that? We find that there's a large increase in the informal sector, which you referred to. Diala. In the informal sector, the highlight that was quite interesting to see is that the main competition was not so much between Jordanians and Syrians, it was between Jordanians and, it was between immigrants, such as Egyptians and Syrians. And so the informal sector was widening, and this is very much a governance story. Excluding them from permits, excluding them from opportunities, it is what's driving them into jobs without contracts, without social security, and therefore in the informal sector.
Interesting.
If I may just say that in Lebanon, and I think this is worth highlighting because this is very much new data in 2019, the informal sector now, the share of employment in the informal sector stands at around 55%. And the share of the informal sector in the economy is around 65%. So I think this is something that we need to think about a bit more carefully.
The new labor survey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. And before I move to Q&A, just allow me to fire up just really quick questions to think about how do we navigate around this to the panelists. Probably just 1 minute each, and perhaps I can start with you, Professor Malik. If we were to think about one area to focus on moving forward, navigating the system that you were discussing, what would it be?
Right. I think this is a good way to think about it because every crisis brings an opportunity to give concessions. What is so surprising since 2011 is that neither in countries that are trying to succeed, like Tunisia, or others which went back to authoritarian rule, like Egypt, there has been no single economic concession. There's no debate for an economic concession. And I think one particular area, in my opinion, could be releasing the space for competition in the private sector. Okay. Now, in order to do that, we need to recognize that all those parts of the market that are controlled by insiders, they will lose from it, right? So why would they allow the loosening of control? So you can think about an area where loosening the market will face the least political resistance. So identify that area. Secondly, an area where there is the greatest potential to create a new constituency. Because if you release the market, you actually create a new constituency who would have a vested stake in the continuation of it. And thirdly, where the cascading impact on the market is higher. Like in Turkey, they released the space for small and medium enterprises. It did not create direct competition with big cronies, but it was connected with the global market, created a new constituency, and had the highest cascading impact on the market.
Thank you. Dr. Sukkarieh, are we alone in this? Is this a Middle East exceptionalism story?
Well, I think, we are still revolving around the same policies we have been talking about since the 90s. And it's all about, widening the competition, the global, but I mean, the nature of capitalism or the global economic system as it is now is built on monopolism, whatever you are. So think of Amazon, or think of Google, and think of Microsoft. They are not making money out, the value is created out of monopoly. It's not created out of production. So, there is a problem everywhere, which is monopoly, or monopoly capitalism, or it's now more merchant capitalism, because it's, Amazon buys everything that comes out, and Microsoft is the same, and so on. So I'm not sure, this is a problem only in the Arab world. This is a problem. Maybe there are issues in the Arab world that are different, but this is the way the economy is going. If we keep on referring to the same market economy and how we increase competition, we are going to be revolving around the same circle we've been talking about, and it led us to where we are now, from the really high level of inequality between those who have and those who have not, and it led us to the climate problem we are living, and so on. So I think we really need to also widen or broaden our imagination to step back and critique all this discourse of market capitalism that we are in. So,
and Bilal, you've worked a lot on economies relating to refugees and the host communities. What could be a major or a main focus for us to ensure inclusive employment for both?
This is interesting, because again, referring to the ecosystem, what we didn't say on the panel is infrastructure.
Yes.
The lack of infrastructure and the provision of the public good that would enable the private and the public sector to mainly the private sector to thrive and create opportunities is predominantly infrastructure. And the age of AI and the internet, it's difficult to think of innovation without infrastructure. Related to infrastructure, we did an experiment in Lebanon where we randomly assigned some Syrians and some Lebanese to different rooms, right? Anybody who's an economist in the room would know why I like randomization. And so we randomly assigned them to a mixed session where they sit together and they play what we call in economics a public good game. And in some sessions, they sat in their own homogeneous groups. So some were Syrian only, some were Lebanese only, and some were mixed. We got them to play this game where everybody has $10, let's say, and they want to invest in the public good. They know that this public good will pay in return. Anyone who knows a bit of game theory knows that the return from the public good makes more return than keeping your original endowment. And what we saw is that as soon as they were in a mixed session, their contribution to the public good dropped. And this was unmistakable. You look at the graph without saying a word, contribution drops. And I found this fascinating, because when we introduced the competition over the public good in a situation with limited infrastructure and opportunities, the other and the outgroup automatically becomes a threat. This is very much perpetuated by a populist and toxic narrative from the top down. I think that's something we also need to think about.
Thank you. And Dr. Maisa, I know you mentioned 3 key areas. Which one of those would you think demands the most immediate attention with regards to employment?
They're all equally important in my mind, and in fact, cannot work. One cannot work without the other. Technology is impacting everything. Climate change is a reality, and conflict, unfortunately, is a big part of our reality. And one of the things that's really important for us to recognize is that when it comes to the Middle East, solving for refugees is no longer a marginal issue. you don't need programs just for refugees. This is now officially a misnomer, because whether we want to recognize it or not, the Arab world is producing the highest number of refugees and displaced people in the world. We only account for 5% of global population, but yet we produce 34% of refugees and 38% of displaced people in the world. Think of that. In Lebanon, a very, very small country, 1 in 6 people are refugees. Okay? 1 in 6. So, yes, the Syrian crisis is the biggest crisis we're facing in the region in terms of refugees. But this is not to mention the fact that, you know, we also have 5.5 million Palestinian refugees. We have Iraqi refugees. We have Yemenis. So it's part and parcel of who we are now as a region. And when we solve for refugees, we need to think of them as part of the system rather than on the margins of the system. And one of the ways that the international community can help with that, and many organizations have started to understand this very well and work with host countries on this, including in places like Lebanon and Jordan. And that is, when you solve for refugees, you also solve for vulnerable communities in the host countries, because that's the only way it's going to work. And we're really starting to see progress in this space. And I agree. Actually, research proves that refugees do not take away from host communities. If anything, they actually contribute. But when solutions are specific only to one population, then they can be damaging. So we need to be inclusive when we think about refugees. And the other thing we need to think about is that, yes, we need to work on policy. I believe in policy change, that's essential, but we also need to think about disrupting through innovation. So I mentioned technology earlier. When we think about, for example, employment, yes, we need to fix the policies around that exclude refugees from working, but increasingly we're seeing that young people who are tech savvy, who have the skills that are needed to work globally, are bypassing national policy systems. So we need to think about that as we solve for the refugee crisis.
Thank you, Maisa. And perhaps, Dr. Kenan, very briefly, your take on our path forward.
Sure. Well, the question go back again of how we can prioritize the development of the ecosystem and how it becomes the umbrella of job creation, if we can think about that. Now, if you look at the 4 countries, you look at their employment strategies, entrepreneurship is one of the interventions that the countries are planning to do. But I would like to reverse that. I would like to create a strategy of entrepreneurship, and that employment becomes one of the interventions of job creations. So that means that we're actually transforming the culture from a job seekers to job producers. Now, this is the promise, I think, because government, we've kind of like public sector's employment is no longer there. It's already, I mean, all governments in the world are shrinking in terms of size. That's a fact, that's given. We cannot just argue against it. Now, when it comes to what can be done when we actually promote entrepreneurship is to go back and focus on skills. Because entrepreneurs need talents, need to find the right people. Otherwise, we'll also run away and we won't be able to capture the right people. Now, how much we're doing in terms of vocational education and training? To be honest, we're among the lowest in terms of quality of vocational education. And this brings it back to a lot of elements, cultural, institutional, because grads of the vocational systems are always looked at as second-class students, besides of the complexity of the work in vocational work environments, very hazardous, don't you get your hands dirty? That's the kind of mindsets that we have, and we counter-argue against the possibilities that can be actually derived from vocational education, whereas countries like Switzerland and Germany, they're massively investing in that. One last point is to actually, it's to make how we can make our entrepreneurship sustainable, and that's something I touched upon very quickly. Like the jobs that we're creating. Maya mentioned sustainability related to environment and climate change. To what extent we're actually embedding other elements with our entrepreneurships. Now, in addition to that, we just need to focus on few greatest ideas okay, that can actually lead the scenes, okay, and create another Silicon Valley in the region. We just need to start somewhere, and that's what actually would be the greatest starting point where we can actually create these ecosystems and create these sustainable jobs. Thank you.
For the sake of time, on that point, please join me in thanking our panelists, and I will open it to... I will open the floor for Q&A. Fadi.
Thank you very much for this extremely interesting panel. I'm going to speak as a practitioner. Sure. So I'm an entrepreneur, and I've spent my life actually in the entrepreneurship space and in trying to build ecosystems in entrepreneurship. So I want to, I think Adil hit it on the nail. Look, the biggest problem in the region to create jobs is the market access issue. You cannot, and you will not solve the local, national jobs unless you allow businesses to scale. And the challenge of scaling businesses in the region is geography and politics and protectionism by markets. So all the efforts, I mean, and I do business in practically every single country in the Arab world, all the efforts all the national efforts regarding job creation are not going to work unless there is market access, because that's what you create size. And to answer your question on the next Silicon Valley is successful only, and I'm putting myself out there, because it has America as a market. Without America as a market, you will not have a Silicon Valley. The largest economy in the world can have many Silicon Valleys. You're not going to have a Silicon Valley in the Arab world unless you have a market. So that's a big challenge. And for my side, just a question. Solving for the many is very difficult. I mean, who solves for the many? What are the many? Is the Arab world the many, or is it the national issue that is the many? Because if we're going to think an Arab world many, I can't, you can't. Because there is nothing called Arab world. There are 22 countries in the Arab world. So how do we solve for these 22 countries so that we can solve for the many? It's a big challenge in the region. It's a political challenge in the region. Why would the foreigner be able to come and address a challenge that is national? What's my job? People will ask, why are you here? Why are you doing these things? Last thing I would say, the entrepreneurship ecosystem in the region is exploding. But not in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. It's happening in the Gulf. Yeah. And the Syrians and the Lebanese and the Jordanians are actually thriving and accessing markets. 3 markets that matter in the region that make at least 60% of the economy: Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. Look at them and see what's happening in these countries.
Thank you, Fad. Thank you. Let me take another question and then we'll proceed. Where's the mic closer? I'll get to it in a second. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much, Diala, for facilitation and for the panelists for the inspiring input. Very fast question. You touched on 3 things that we're not speaking about in the Middle East. What about the artificial intelligence? As you know, after 40 years, when this disruptive technology takes place, if you travel maybe from Syria to the USA, we're like traveling 200 years to the future, from the minute you enter the airport to all aspects of life. And we're way behind this. So what do you think about this revolution and how it will impact the Middle East as well?
Shall we answer or take one more question? And then, let's take one more question then. And then.
I have a question, actually. Yes, after you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Salman Nims. I'm from Jordan, and I'm a very old scholar of Said Foundation. And although I work now on gender equality, but actually my master's and PhD were in sustainable development long time ago, when the Arab world did not even know what does it mean. So when I went to apply for jobs, nobody wanted me because they didn't know what I was doing. So anyway, that was in 1999. But you know what I think is, I mean, we all touched upon it, but we're missing, and we're missing even having a panel about it. It's political reform. Because everything you talked about talks about the structural problem. Who is, you know, Fadi was talking about solving for everyone, and you were talking about it. there is no equality in front of the law. Professor Malik, you were talking about this relation between the private sector and those who in the networks. Who's going to solve this? If we do not have transparency, accountability, right democracies, everything we're doing is only small solutions. What you were talking about, Bilal, about this narrative, it's the governments that created this narrative. It's not the Jordanians. It's the governments. And, you know, we were talking about it, and then the response plan for the refugees, and it was always like, oh, Jordan, it's always us, you know, governments really using these crises to get more funds. And then the question is, where did this all funding go without the right governance, which Saruz was talking about? That's the World Bank. Where is their responsibility actually in asking governments to actually be more accountable for real change, for the mindsets of our youth and our governments and policymakers?
Thank you so much. Mustafa, I'd like to hear your question next because you were waiting, and then I'll open the floor for the committee.
My name is Mustafa Hashim. I'm a Said Foundation and Chevening Joint Scholar from Jordan, studying sustainable energy systems at the University of Edinburgh. My question is, I have seen a lot of youth and young professionals, especially in the energy and environment sector, either working in Jordan or in the other 3 countries, really struggling to have that job opportunities, and they have all the potentials, the certificates, the trainings, the skills, the education that they need in order to secure a job, but still they struggle to find one. And I noticed part of the problem rely heavily on the employers themselves, because they are underestimating the potentials of the youth and underestimating their equality, or they are fearing from their age or the lack of their professional experience. So what have done, or what could be done as a policies or let's say as an action plans in order also to influence the employers themselves, not the youth? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Allow me to open the floor for the panelists. Maisa, I know you've been addressed directly for a question, so.
That's great. Thank you for the comments, all very valuable. The first one, an easy one, about artificial intelligence. Forgive me, I lump it all into technology, but absolutely, it's a critical part of thinking about these solutions. And for me, what really scares me is in the Middle East, we're on the receiving end. We're not even the back office of what's happening in technology. So we're not shaping it. We're not part of it, and that's very scary. And we don't lack talent, and we don't lack ability. We really need to be part of framing that. And we need to stop shipping our most talented overseas. Coming back to the issue of how do you solve this at large scale, this is not something that one individual can do. You're absolutely right, Fadi. It requires group effort. It requires people coming together from all sectors. It requires, yes, working with government. It is absolutely essential to work with government. What's interesting, however, is that despite all the challenges that we're facing, I do feel that there is change. There is change even from the perspective of government, because government is realizing that the problems that the education, the focus has always been on reforming the education system. But there was one element that's missing in that reform. There are lots of things that are missing in the reform of education, but one critical element is the connection to the job market. And one of the best things that we can do is to encourage young people to ask a very simple question to the education system that they want to subscribe to, especially universities. How many of your graduates get jobs? It's amazing. I've done a lot of research on this, surveyed a lot of young people around the region. This is not a question they were asking only a few years ago, but increasingly they are asking that question. That makes universities very uncomfortable. They don't think that they are responsible for what happens with their graduates when they leave. And in fact, they do. And a very important issue that we have not touched upon today, but I know that we all on the panel agree on, is that we are completely missing the boat on technical education. Technical education, and I don't want to even call it vocational education because there's this very big negative feeling about it in the Arab world. It is where the vast majority of new jobs are happening. It's important for reskilling those graduates who are unemployed, and it's important for those that are coming into the job market today. And employers can't find enough highly qualified technical graduates. We're even seeing European markets coming to the few vocational schools that are available in the region saying, if you graduate, you know, X number of thousand of students, we will take them. So we need to jump on this opportunity very critically.
Raisa. Thank you. I know Bilal and Dr. Maysoon want to have some comments as well. Bilal, do you want to start?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I completely agree that the political narrative is very much propagated from the top down, and it poisons the mind of the people who are basically acting on it. And you know, we've seen it with the refugee crisis, we've seen it in Lebanon with the sectarianism, we've seen it in all sorts. So I wouldn't contest that at all. What I would say though is we're missing out on data, and for accountability you need data. And I think I would love to basically put a call out here with such a brilliant group of people, including scholars and practitioners and private sector, is please make your data available. I think that the Arab world, well, let's say the SJLP, is really lacking in terms of data creation. And without evidence, it's impossible to make that narrative. Jordan has amazing capacities in terms of statistics creation. I think there's a lot more that can still be done.
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing it up. And
yeah, just one point. I really want to ask if scaling, like, you know, Silicon Valley or Google or Amazon are solving the problem of unemployment. Because, wait, just one moment. Like, we know how Amazon, like, you know, they operate on modern slavery way of employment, that they are, oh, come on, like, you know, this is how it goes. And Silicon Valley, Google, all these, the level of unemployment in the US is still really high. So there is no correlation between this scaling and the unemployment we are talking about. This, like, you know, something to think about. And also, it is connected to how we talk about, you know, like public sector. Why do young people want to work in the public sector? Because they have more benefits in the public sector than if there was a poll in Jordan when they said, like, we can work in anything, but they want health insurance and they want free education. This is what they want. So it's not like we are really infatuated with the public sector. It is what the private sector is offering for the young people that is not suiting them. So, I think this is connected also to why...
That started with this discussion.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
maybe another time,
okay,
but for now,
thank you.
I think
yes.
Lunch. So please find the panelists if you have any further questions, and thank you so much.